Now we're going. We are so happy to have Reyna Grande with us today for a talk. And I'd like to thank, in addition to the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies, the Vilas Fund at UW-Milwaukee. We originally invited Reyna more than a year ago to be a keynote speaker in our spring plan symposium on migration in the Americas, which did not happen. So we have this chance now to have her join us, and I feel like we have a wider audience for you now too, this way. Just a few housekeeping notes. Having cameras on is most welcome. It's always nice for the speaker to see some audience, completely up to you. If you're just joining and you want to introduce yourself in the chat, we'd appreciate it. It's just nice to know who this community is. Keep your mics off during the talk, but it'd be quite okay to turn them on long enough afterwards to hear hands clapping or verbal thanks. We will do a Q&A afterwards. I will try my best. We can try to do it both with raised hands and questions in the chat. If it turns out I can't multitask, then we'll just go to the chat, but we'll give it a go. Born in Iguala, Mexico, Reyna Grande is the author of the best-selling memoir, The Distance Between Us, and the sequel, A Dream Called Home. Her other works include the novels Across 100 Mountains and Dancing with Butterflies. The Distance Between Us is also available as a young reader's edition. Her work has garnered many awards, with many of her books adopted as common read selections by schools, colleges, and cities across the country. One of my favorite reviews of her work appeared in Eureka of A Dream Called Home. And you can find it, the complete review on her website as well as Eureka's website. It said, candid and emotionally complex, Grande's book celebrates one woman's tenacity in the face of hardship and heartbreak, while offering hope to other immigrants as they fight to remain and make their voices heard in a changing America. Welcome, Reyna.
Thank you so much. Thank you everybody for joining us today. I really wish I was there in person to greet you all and to visit Wisconsin. I don't know if you know, I know some of you who have read Dream Called Home know, but the rest of you might not know that my husband is from Wisconsin. He was born in Racine. And we used to go to Wisconsin a lot in the winters until I protested and I said no more winters in Wisconsin. And then we started going more in the summers. And I love the summers in Wisconsin. That is so beautiful. And his father's side of the family, most of them live in Manitowish waters. So we would go there in the summer and it's just really idyllic and I miss it very much. Unfortunately, his mother moved from Racine a couple of years ago and she went to North Carolina where it's a little warmer. So now it's kind of hard to visit because, you know, my mother-in-law is gone and my father-in-law moved to Hollywood, California. So it's been harder and harder to make a visit to Wisconsin, but it's definitely one of the places I enjoy very much. And if you read A Dream Called Home, you'll get to hear about my adventures when I first visited, and a little bit of culture shock too that I experienced. But I love my husband's family. It has been very welcoming and loving, and definitely I like that with my mother-in-law because she's such a wonderful mother-in-law, but mostly she's such a wonderful grandma. So I appreciate that very much. So I want to talk a little bit about my writing journey, my immigrant journey, and I'm going to open it up for questions later on. So I do hope that you have questions, whether or not you have read my work. Feel free to ask me any questions because I'm literally an open book. So there's no right or wrong question, and we can get as personal as you want to get. And yeah, so I'm really looking forward to opening it up into a conversation. So I'm not just like talking at you, and I would love to hear some of your own thoughts, and any questions that you have. One of the things that I have been thinking about recently a lot is, how magical my journey has been. And yes, if you read my work, you magical might not be the word, because it's my journey as an immigrant, as a writer, was full of a lot of obstacles, a lot of heartbreak, and disappointments, and sorrow. But when I look back on my journey, I do think it was magical, and it was magical in the sense that I understand completely that if things had been different, even just one thing had been different, I would not be who I am today, and I would not be where I am today. So I've been thinking a lot more about, those circumstances that led me to this place in my life. And I really love where I am today in terms of my career as a professional writer. I love what I do. I just can't imagine doing anything else, and I'm so grateful for the universe for allowing me to have this career. Um, I love, my family and my home, and I've been able to create a beautiful, stable home for myself and for my children. So I think, how far I have come and how close I came to not having this life, to not having this home. So one of the things that I think about is how, when I was in Mexico, I would have never have become a reader, and I would have never have become a writer. So it really did take for me to migrate in order for me to even have like a small opportunity to to become, the writer that I am today. And in Mexico, in my hometown in Iguala, the state of Guerrero, where I was born, is a very, very poor state. It's the second poorest state in Mexico. And nowadays, it has become one of the most violent states in Mexico because of the cartel and the war on drugs. Um, you know, 6 years ago, we're going on to 7 years now, 43 students were disappeared in my hometown in Guerrero. And to this day, we still don't really know what happened. And, they're still trying to solve the case and find out what happened to the missing 43 college students. And they were disappeared just 10 minutes away from where my family lives. So my state has definitely been the kind of place where there's just not a lot of opportunities for poor people to get out of their poverty. Basically you're born in poverty and you die in that same poverty you were born into. Because of that poverty, my family, my parents, for example, had to work since they were little. My father, when he was in third grade, was taken out of school by his father and put to work in the fields. And my mother was only allowed to finish sixth grade before she also had to leave school in order to help her family put food on the table. So there was no chance really for anybody in my family to to read, to be exposed to books, to be exposed to literature, to fall in love with stories. Um, there was also no money to buy any books. When The Distance Between Us came out in Mexico a few years ago, this is the Mexican edition, the Spanish edition, I went to do events in Mexico, do some readings. And it was really bittersweet for me to have that experience because I was really excited, to be able to share my work with my countrymen. And I had been a published author in the US already for 11 years. This is where I launched my career. And this was my first time visiting Mexico as a writer. And I was really excited to go promote the book. But then I realized that my book over there in Mexico costs 200 pesos, and the daily minimum wage in Mexico is 100 pesos. So people who make 100 pesos a day, and my book costs 200 pesos. I mean, that's 2 days worth of wages if you want to buy a book. And most people don't have the money to be, spending on books, on literature. And this is why, like, even if people have an interest in reading, um, they don't have access to literature, they don't have access to books. And living in Mexico, in my hometown, I certainly didn't have that kind of access. Um, so there were no readers in my family, and for writers, like most writers, you have to be a reader first before you're a writer. So I know very well that had I stayed in Mexico, had I not have, access to reading, I would not have become a writer. um, so my father, because the poverty that we experienced in Mexico, that we lived in, he decided to come to the United States to look for work. And he left when I was 2, and then he sent for my mother when I was 4.5. So my mother also came here to work. And together, my father and my mother were working towards building us a house in Mexico, and just improving our quality of life in our own country. That was the plan. The plan was not for all of us to migrate, to the U.S. My dad really wanted to just build us a house in Mexico, make a little money here, and then go back. But unfortunately, things just went from bad to worse after they left, with Mexico going into a recession, and there were no jobs at all. And that's when, in the 80s, there was a lot of migration from Mexico here to the US. So even though my father and my mother managed to build us this house that he wanted, we never lived in it. And the plan changed, and my father decided that our best chance at having a better life was for us to come here. And that was how he went back to Mexico, and he brought my older sister, my older brother, and me across the border. And that's how we ended up in Los Angeles. And once I was in LA, that was when,
I wonder if this
again,
piece
like,
is good.
once I was in LA, that was when, for me, things started to kind of fall into place. And one of the best things that ever happened, upon my migration, was that I started to have access to books through my public library. And I cannot stress enough, how public libraries can change lives. And it certainly changed mine. Because all of a sudden, for an immigrant girl like me, whose family did not have an interest in reading and who didn't have money to buy books, having access to a public library and having all these books at my disposal, began to have such a positive impact on me. And I spent a lot of time in the public library reading a lot of books. And of course, at first I mostly read because I wanted to improve my English. I wanted to learn English faster. And one of the things that I did was I borrowed books from the public library section of the books on tape. Back then, they used to be called books on tape. Now they're called audiobooks. And that really helped me so much with my pronunciation. And English is so complicated when it comes to pronunciation, with long vowels and short vowels and the schwa sound and all of that nonsense. And I struggle so much learning how to pronounce. So audiobooks from the public library helped me out so much. And that's how I started to learn the language, get more confident in it. But ultimately, it just led to me falling in love with reading, falling in love with stories, and eventually I wanted to write my own stories. From there, I was very fortunate, after I developed a love of reading and a love of writing, I was fortunate that when I went to community college, um, I met a professor, my English professor, who encouraged me to keep working on my writer's craft, and she was the one who encouraged me to major in creative writing. And she was the first teacher, whoever said to me that I had writing talent, and she said that I should pursue a career as a writer. So those were some very important moments for me, like to start kind of finding my way in terms of being a writer. And of course, as an immigrant writer, one of the things that I love to write about all the time is immigration. That's how I see the world, through the eyes of an immigrant. I feel that my immigrant experiences have helped me to understand, um, and to be able to criticize the country that I live in, the United States, and also the country that I left, right, in Mexico. It allows me to kind of see the life in both sides, and to understand, like, my place in both countries, and how both countries, the way they work, and how, the social, um, the structures, that the institutions, how they might silence people. And it has taught me a lot in terms of how to stand up for myself and fight for what I believe in, and to not be afraid to push back when I need to push back. So, a lot of the challenges that I faced when I lived in Mexico has really informed how I live my life now, and the challenges that I have faced living here in this country has also contributed more to the way I have learned to advocate for myself and for my community. So, in addition to understanding, how the opportunities that I received by immigrating, other things that I have been thinking about too is, in terms of like the circumstances that helped me to be who I am today, is thinking about like the time when I migrated versus the time that, recent immigrants have been immigrating, right? And I think how back in the 1980s, when I crossed the border when I was 9 years old, things were things were different. Um, it definitely, first of all, crossing the border was not as dangerous as it is today. So I try to imagine like what the border crossing looks like today versus how it looked like when I crossed the border in 1985. And it has changed so much. When I crossed in 1985, my father took us through the San Diego Tijuana border. And back in the 80s, there was no wall, there was no border wall. The border wall in that region was built in the 1990s during the Clinton administration. So before, when we crossed, there was no wall. And I feel that my border crossing was not anywhere near as dangerous as, it is today to cross the border. Once the border wall started being built, it forced migrants to seek other different points of entry, other areas to cross, and it drove them deeper into more danger, because now they started crossing through the desert, and it just became riskier and riskier trying to cross over. So I think about how lucky I was that during my border crossing, um, I did not end up, I did not end up, dying crossing the border. And also I think about how, um, with our former, president, there were a lot of things that were happening, you're right, at the border, making things even more dangerous. Like children being detained for very, 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 very long times. Um, Children being separated from their parents. So there was a lot of like family separation going on. So it made me think a lot about my own journey as an immigrant and how in today's America, I would have ended up, detained, deported, or dead at the border, right? So that is something for me that I think about a lot because through the years, like I feel sometimes I feel like survivor's guilt, you know, that has weighed a lot on me through the years, like survivor's guilt. I feel it when I go to Mexico to see my family who stay behind. And when I see the poverty in which they live, and then I'm able to get on an airplane and come back and leave that poverty behind. I feel so much guilt being able to do that. So there's this survivor's guilt in when I go visit my country in Mexico, but then there's survivor's guilt when I hear about migrants dying at the border. Like you remember when that little toddler, that 2-year-old, washed up in the banks of the Rio Grande, and she drowned crossing the border with her father. And I remember, like, looking at that picture, of them and just thinking, like, just feeling guilty that I made it and she didn't. And I feel that guilt a lot every time I hear about migrants dying at the border. I always feel that, I made it and they didn't. Or I think about the children who are, still in detention centers, and I think about how that didn't happen to me, and they have to go through that and suffer that. And when we crossed over, the border patrol, caught us twice, but they didn't take us away from our father. They just drove us across the border, left us there, and then the next day, we tried again. And so then there's that guilt too, right? That I was lucky, and yet there have been so many other migrants who have not been lucky, who have not had these opportunities that I have had. And then of course, there's things that have been happening here, like for example, the Dream Act, that has been proposed several times, and it has never passed. It has never passed. It has never become a law. And there's so many, undocumented youth in this country who would greatly benefit from having the Dream Act pass and having the opportunity to legalize their status and to be able to not live their lives in fear, to be able to pursue their dreams, to not have, all of these obstacles and closed doors. And I think about how I was so fortunate to have the opportunity to legalize my status when I was a teenager. And, like I said, when I crossed over in 1985, things were very different. And a year after my family and I crossed over in 86, that was when President Reagan, signed Eureka into law, and that allowed 3 million people to legalize their status. And both my father and my mother were one of those people who were given the opportunity to legalize their status. So by the time when I turned 15, that was when I got my green card. And after that point, I never had to worry again, about being undocumented, about not having the opportunities that I needed to have in order to succeed. So that's another source for me in terms of like that survivor's guilt of understanding my privilege, and understanding how fortunate I have been to have received these opportunities that have allowed me to get to where I am today. So I know that Dream Act has just been proposed again, and I'm so optimistic. I really, really hope that this time around it finally passes and that we can finally give our undocumented youth, our young people, the opportunities that they need to thrive, to reach their full potential. And of course, it's a benefit to them, but it's also going to be a great benefit to the country as a whole, to be able to have all this talent, all this talent and skills and passion. And we need our young people now more than ever to help us turn this country around and to really, improve life for all. So that's what I'm hoping for. And to me, it's important that as somebody who has benefited, from all these different opportunities and just the right circumstances and a little bit of luck, all of that, I want other immigrants who are, going through the same journey that I went through. I want them to have the opportunities that I have had. And yeah, so that's something that as a writer, that's what I'm advocating for. That's what I'm pushing for. And this has become, for me, one of my own personal goals is to use my writing to be able to raise my voice for my immigrant community. And that is one of the reasons, that keeps me going. I feel that every book I write, all my books have been about immigration. And I try to write about immigration, humanize the issue, help people understand, who immigrants are. And I know that, immigration is a very complex topic. And I don't want to say like I'm an expert on immigration and the immigration issue, but I am an expert on what it's like to be an immigrant, a Mexican immigrant. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. And that's why I also like to write very personal stories. I don't really do a lot of like articles on immigration and write about statistics and numbers. Like I leave that to the media, I leave that to reporters. For me, it's more important to really try to capture the humanity of it, and that's why when you read my work, it's extremely personal. I like to take my readers into this, experience of being an immigrant and to really make you feel it in your body, in your heart, like this is what it's like. I also don't try to like romanticize the immigrant experience, so if you read my books, I don't shy away from being critical of, um, the decisions, that immigrants can make, or for example, like with my parents, I don't shy away from being critical of that either. So that's where I'm coming from in terms of being a writer. And I hope to continue to write more about immigration and to help, my readers understand this issue. And for us to, just be able to treat our immigrant communities with compassion, with respect and with dignity, and for us to come together as a country and to decide like, how can we be more welcoming as a society and welcome, the immigrants that are here among us, and how we can work together to make this country a better place for all of us. So I want to open it up for questions because I'm really eager to hear what some of your thoughts are, or those of you who have read my work. I would love to hear any questions that you might have.
Thank you so much, Reyna. While people are thinking of their questions, could I share with you, Ali had made the effort to email a couple questions to me to pass along, and I'll share this with you because there's also a very nice lead-in comment about your work. Ali, I'm just going to go with one question. We'll come back to the second if we have time. Ali asked, what's next in terms of works and general ideas? How about the kids who never had the chance to come to the US? Is there any future work to encourage them to empower themselves and build their lives through education and personal prosperity?
Mhm. Yeah, to me that's something that I advocate for, like especially like when I go to Mexico to see my family, it really helps me to understand what are some things that we can do to to make sure that people don't feel forced to leave their homes. And one of the things that makes me really sad, when we talk about immigration here, or the way we want to tackle immigration here, is to, deterrence, right? Like build a border wall, have more border patrol agents, and throw immigrants into detention centers to try to deter them from coming. Or when the children were being separated from their families, that was a deterrent also. And parents were being told, well, if you don't want your kids taken from you, then don't bring them. So to me, like, those are just really like inhumane ways to decrease immigration. And I think about, like, why don't we talk about the factors, right, that are causing this migration, and how can we tackle those factors, and in an effort to decrease it, in an effort to make sure that people don't feel the need to migrate, that they don't feel that that's really the only choice they have, is to leave their homes. Because most people you talk to, I mean, they'll tell you they don't want to leave their homes. They don't want to be migrants or refugees or asylum seekers. They want to be able to stay home and to be able to have a better life in their countries by staying home and staying together with their families. So what can we do to make sure that we create better circumstances for people to be able to stay home? So until we start working towards that, I'm afraid that, we are going to continue to see migration, because there's so much instability in other countries. And some of that instability has been created by, US policies, right? Or trade agreements that don't really benefit other countries, but here, for our own country. Um, there's a lot of violence going on, and a lot of poverty, extreme poverty, where, like I mentioned earlier, like just with the example of my book costing 2 days worth of wages. I mean, if you think about what that means in terms of the poverty, so people are working and they're just making $5 a day, and you cannot survive on $5 a day, but those are the circumstances in which a lot of people live, not just in Mexico or Central America. But unless we can work towards that, I feel that that's really when we're going to see decrease in migration, is when we can start working together to help other countries stabilize their situations and to improve the quality of life, so that people are not forced to leave their homes.
Marie, you have a question. You want to turn your mic on?
So, hi, I'm here with my husband, Zeno Franco, and we also lived in the Los Angeles area, and we met tango dancing in Pomona, because I was at Claremont Graduate School. So,
wow.
Zeno has a question.
Yeah, and I don't mean to make this overly political, but I guess, my father was born in Manzanillo, Colima, in Mexico, and we've been thinking a lot about different things. I mean, how do we transmit the culture to our own children? We started putting up an ofrenda, not for my own sake so much as to just be sure that we transmit some of those things to the kids. Can you, yeah, so my daughter's running in and out, so she hears us talking about her too. I think I'm struggling a little bit right now with Hispanic men that I have a lot of respect for, who are supportive of the former president and supportive of the immigration policies. And I mean, I feel a very visceral reaction to that. You know, as a Mexican American, I don't understand how you could allow women and children to be separated at the border and to be okay with that, having that in your own background.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, those are very difficult things to talk about, because it definitely happens within our own families. You know, even like in the Latino community, there's a lot of Trump supporters, right? And it's hard to think about, but it's also not that uncommon. You know, if you think about within our community, the Latino community, there has been times where we have also turned against our own immigrants. For example, you know, like here in California, when Proposition 187 passed, a lot of Latinos voted for Prop 187, and it denied, you know, a lot of resources for immigrants, including, you know, having access to public education. So I understand, like, sometimes this happens in that in this country, I feel, because the Latino community tends to, you know, face a lot of discrimination, and there's lack of opportunities for Latinos. Those who live here and are born here and grow up here, they kind of get the same mistreatment at times as the recent immigrants. So then they end up turning against those immigrants as well, to try to like have a separation from the recent arrivals, and, you know, feel like, oh, we're Americans, we belong here, and we shouldn't be mistreated the way the immigrants are. But because of that, you know, the racism that is here, I mean, any Latino, regardless of whether they were born here or they were born, you know, somewhere else, whether they've been here for generations, they still face the same challenges in terms of that the way they're, you know, there's so much discrimination and lack of opportunities in all of the different institutions here in this country, and just trying to break through that door and to succeed is definitely difficult. So I can see why time there can be some backlash against our own, you know, immigrants, and trying to create that separation, that we're not like them or we're not them. At the same time, you know, I do appreciate when, like you said, you know, in your own family, you grow up celebrating your culture and your roots, and make sure that, you know, you continue to hold on to that bond, right, that you have with your roots. That's something that I try to do also here with my children. And it's a little bit harder too, because, you know, my husband is white, I'm Mexican, and trying to raise the children, you know, in a bicultural home, it's a little bit challenging. And sometimes I have to say, you know, it's so hard, because like I see my children again and again like rejecting my Mexican culture, and I have to like force it down their throats at times, you know. There have been moments when I feel a little bit hurt at their behavior, of how they reject, you know, this culture and this Mexican heritage that I want to pass on to them. There was one, there's been several moments, but one moment that I've been wanting to write about is when my daughter was little, she got into my eye makeup and she put blue eyeliner. Blue eyeshadow. And then she comes running to me and she says, look, mommy, my eyes are turning blue like daddy's. And my children are so obsessed with my husband's blue eyes. um, and then, she's always looking at my skin color and her dad's skin color. And yeah, it's difficult. But then also, that same mentality, it's prevalent in even in the Latino community. Like when I married my husband, I remember my mother said to me, oh, I hope that you have blue-eyed children. They will look so beautiful. My own mother. And then of course when my daughter was born with brown eyes, she was disappointed. So there's like that internalized racism that we have experienced, which then kind of shows itself, right, when we end up voting for Trump. So those are the kind of things that I feel we need to do a little bit more of soul searching and figure out what can we do as a community to not be like that.
Reyna, we have a question from Shane in Fond du Lac. Reyna, can you discuss your challenges in learning English as a child in LA while retaining your literacy in Spanish? In your writing process, do you write in English? How is your memoir different in English and Spanish languages?
Yeah, so my journey in learning English was very traumatic because when I came to Los Angeles at the time, my school, the elementary school I went to, did not have bilingual education, which now they do, which I'm really, really happy about. But back then there was no bilingual education, and there wasn't like ESL classes or resources for newcomers. I know more and more schools nowadays have newcomer centers where they try to help out the recent arrivals. But my school did not have any of that. So I went through a sink or swim situation where I was put into an English only classroom. And it was very traumatic in that, I didn't speak a word of English. I came into this classroom where I felt voiceless and I felt invisible because my teacher put me in a little corner of her classroom and then she just ignored me the whole year. So because I felt voiceless, or I internalized this disdain for my language, my native language. I felt that I spoke the wrong language, that it was wrong, and that the only way I was going to have a voice in this country was to speak English. And then because I felt so invisible, I also felt that the only way I was going to be seen was if I spoke English. So because of that, I started to reject my native tongue, and I developed a very, complicated relationship with it, in that I became ashamed of it. And I started to read, like I mentioned earlier, I was reading a lot just so that I could learn English faster, so that I could just start feeling that I belong here, that I had a voice. So through the years, I embraced English, and I experienced something that I didn't know the word for it until later. It's called subtractive bilingualism, which is when you replace your mother tongue with English. So instead of learning a second language and adding a second language, I was replacing my Spanish with English. So I lost my Spanish and I gained English. So that was subtraction, not an addition. I did not start to relearn my Spanish until I got to college. I was really fortunate because at the university I went to, they offered Spanish for Spanish speakers. And almost all the students in my Spanish for Spanish speakers class were all children like me who had, whose mother tongue was Spanish, and then they had completely lost it. And we could speak it, but we didn't have any formal like training on it. So I started to relearn, a lot of the words I had forgotten or I didn't know. I started to read more in Spanish, and I learned like about accents and conjugations and all of that. So it took me a really long time. I'm still not, as fluent in Spanish as I would like. And when The Distance Between Us came out, I wanted to do my own translation into Spanish because it was, because all of the writing that I do is in English. And I always feel guilty. Like I kind of feel like I'm betraying my native tongue by only writing in English all the time. So then by translating my own work, I thought I could use my Spanish in my work finally and just try to, embrace it more. So I did the Spanish translation of The Distance Between Us, and then it came out. And then I started to get a lot of emails from people telling me how many mistakes I had made. And they would send me the page numbers too, just so that I could find my mistakes right away. And then I did an interview on Univision, the Spanish network. I did an interview with Jorge Ramos, who's one of our most beloved journalists, reporters. And he interviewed me on his show Al Punto about the book. And I struggled, I struggled during the interview to speak in Spanish because I was translating in my head from English to Spanish. So my Spanish was kind of clunky. And of course, I was nervous being, on television in front of the cameras, answering his questions. And I remember right after they turned off the cameras, when the interview was over, he looked at me and he says, "You don't speak Spanish too well, do you?" And it's like, I already know that. I don't need to be told. And it just hurt me coming from Jorge Ramos, for him to acknowledge and point out that my Spanish is pretty terrible. And then, of course, later I got another email, and this one was from Sandra Cisneros telling me that my Spanish edition had a lot of mistakes, and that she had given the book to a writer friend of hers in Mexico who refused to read my book because it had so many mistakes. She just couldn't deal with it. And she encouraged me to look into it and see how we could fix the translation. So those were some of the difficult moments of having translated my work and realizing that I should not have done it, that I did not have a good handle on Spanish to be able to do that. So then when this book was gonna come out, my editor did not want me to do the translation, and I didn't ask this time around to do the translation. So instead, we hired a translator from Mexico City to do it. And when I received the manuscript translated by him, I could not understand it. I had to look up words in the dictionary all the time because I didn't know the vocabulary he had used was so like high. I didn't know a lot of the words, and I kept looking up in the dictionary for the words, and then I kind of went through this trauma of feeling that there was so much I didn't know of my own native tongue. And then I felt that these are the words that I had lost, or this is what I had lost by immigrating. And then I just reminded myself that even if I hadn't immigrated, I still wouldn't know those fancy words in Spanish because I wouldn't have gone to school long enough to learn, to have a highly developed vocabulary in Spanish anyway. So we had to work on it to get rid of all the fancy language and bring it back down to my level, because I wanted the translation to sound like me, to have my voice. So we had to redo it and to bring it down. So now I like this translation. It reads a little bit more like me.
Reyna, we have another question from Megan. A common theme seems to be that we, as the US, are partially at fault for the current state of Latin American countries, and we have the resources available to help. I also feel as though it's up to us, the younger generation, to create a better future. As college kids who aren't fully independent adults yet, what can we do to help?
Yeah, that is something that I do feel, sometimes as Americans, we don't want to think about the fact that some of the things that are happening, like especially like in Latin America, for example, are things that were created or somewhat brought about because of the things that we have done as a country, right? For example, like just like in my hometown, like I mentioned earlier about how, my state of Guerrero, there's been a lot of violence because of the war on drugs. And the war on drugs has been funded, highly funded by the United States. So a lot of the violence that we saw in Mexico come about because of this war on drugs. I mean, we were the ones that were sending, millions of dollars to Mexico to fund this war. We're providing, the weapons, helicopters, that then those things fall into the hands of the cartel. And also, like, for example, the drugs themselves, my hometown has been like surrounded by poppy fields, and Guerrero supplies a lot of the heroin, right, to the drug trade. So you think about like how we try to tackle the problem over there, and we're like, oh well, Mexico is flooding us with drugs. They're sending all the drugs over here without us acknowledging how there's a drug problem here. We have a very high level of drug addiction, drug abuse, and it's the supply and demand, right? So the more we demand it here, of course, the more that they're going to keep producing over there. And so that's also creating. So it's good to think about like what's going on, what do we do here that then has an impact over there. And there's somebody said something, and I don't know, I wish I knew where it comes from, but there's this expression in the immigrant community that I hear a lot that goes, "We are here because you were there." And I feel like that pretty much captures that reality, that yeah, there are so many immigrants that are here because we were there, right, doing something in other countries that perhaps we shouldn't have been doing, like destabilizing democracies somewhere else. Yeah, so that's something for us to think about. And what can we know? I mean, one of the things that we can do is to kind of start acknowledging how we have impacted other communities and destabilized other societies, and how we have created migrants, and what can we do to make sure that we reverse those things so that people are no longer forced to flee their homes, and that we're not contributing to the displacement of people.
Raul, who's here in Milwaukee, asked, could you please talk about how your first book deal evolved?
My first book deal?
How it came about.
Yeah, so my first book that I wrote, it's this one here, Across 100 Mountains. And this was actually my senior project when I was an undergrad at UC Santa Cruz. I was majoring in creative writing. So in order to graduate, I had to turn in a senior project, and I turned in half of this novel. And then after I graduated, it took me about 3 years to finish it. So I was very fortunate because when I was living in LA, I heard of this program called Emerging Voices. And I bring it up because they're accepting applications right now, and it's going to be done virtually. So you don't have to live in LA to qualify to apply for this program. It's called Emerging Voices, offered by Penn America. And it's a 7-month mentorship program for aspiring writers, where you get paired up with a professional writer as a mentor, and then they bring speakers and you get free classes, writing classes. So I worked on this book during my fellowship with Emerging Voices. And that is where I met my agent. She was one of the speakers that talked about, the publishing industry, and she talked about how to get an agent. So after she finished her talk, I reached out to her and I said, I have this novel, can I send it to you? So she liked the novel and she took me on as a client, and then she started to send out the manuscript to different publishers. We got rejected by 26 publishers. They all kept saying no, that they were not interested in an immigrant story. And then finally, number 27 said yes. And Atria Books is the publisher who gave me the opportunity to publish my first novel. And I have been with Atria ever since then. They have published all of my books. So I was very fortunate to be able to find an agent. And, even though we had 26 rejections, we just needed that one rejection. And that's kind of what, like, I always tell everybody, that you could get 100 rejections, but all you need is that one yes. So hold on for that, hold on for that one yes, and don't give up. No matter how many rejections come in, you just need that one yes.
Isel asked the question, did you always have the inspiration from your experiences of immigration to drive your passion for writing? Did your inspiration change and evolve over time? And what is your advice for young writers looking for inspiration? You've certainly addressed the how to stick with it.
Yeah, I think my inspiration has changed through the years because before, when I first started writing, my inspiration was on a more personal level, like me trying to tell my stories. And part of it was that even though I was reading a lot, going to the public library to get all these books to read, there weren't that many Latino titles available. So I wasn't reading a lot of uh, Latino, Chicano writers. And I struggled to see myself in the books that I was reading. So every time I read, I always felt a little bit like an outsider in all the stories I would read. And I would ask myself, like, where am I? Where are my experiences? So then I started to write my own stories, like, I think it was Toni Morrison that said you have to write the books that you want to read. And so that's kind of where my motivation came from, was writing the books that I wanted to read and I was not finding. So that's where I began. I think now, where I am now in terms of my writing, I do it more still for personal reasons, but also because I have learned that writing is such a powerful tool for like literary activism, and that I could be out like protesting somewhere, like going and holding up signs and protesting, but I can also protest here in my own office just by writing stories about my community, writing stories about immigration, I mean, that is a form of protest. And that's how I have learned to see my writing as literary activism, and just to use it, you know, to advocate for my community and to raise my voice for immigrants.
Thank you. Michael is going back to the phrase you shared that had struck you. He said, one of my class themes is, we didn't come to you, you came to us. I'm wondering if that was the phrase you were thinking of.
That sounds very similar, but yeah, the phrase that I remember was, "We are here because you were there." But I just don't know who said it. But
Yeah.
I thought it's a very meaningful phrase. But I like that one too. We didn't come to you, you came to us. That is very true.
I know Marie had to leave to teach, but she had another question. Are you raising your children bilingual as well as bicultural?
I that question that question sometimes bugs me, because white people don't get asked that question. You know, only like people of color get asked that question. Latinos get asked that question. But like if my husband was talking, they wouldn't ask him that question if he's raising his kids bilingually. But I get asked that question. And then it also bugs me because I'm ashamed to say, you know, what the answer is. With my children, I did not teach them Spanish. I was not raising them bilingually because of my language traumas, you know, that I mentioned earlier. I I I hardly ever spoke to my kids in Spanish. So my son, he doesn't really speak that much Spanish. I mean, he knows a few words here and there. And my daughter, she also just knew like a few little words here and there. But then we moved to Northern California, and the community we moved to had a bilingual program. And I begged them to take my daughter in. She started second grade in this bilingual program, and she started to pick up Spanish. So now she's fully bilingual, and you know, she's, I think her reading level is like 8th grade in English and 6th grade in Spanish, but she has become completely bilingual, and without the trauma that I experienced. Because with her, what I've noticed is in her bilingual program, and I really love bilingual programs. I wish that all of our schools had bilingual programs. In that, with her, she did not experience subtractive bilingualism like I did. You know, with her, it was additive bilingualism. So she did add a second language, and she didn't have to lose anything. And now, you know, she's bilingual, and to me, I feel like she's learned to be more, not less, right? Whereas my experience with learning a new language was definitely traumatic, but not for her.
Kirsten asks, who are your current literary role models? Who are the people in your life that lift you up or inspire you?
My literary models, I mean, I really love Chicano Latino writers, just because I know that it's very challenging to be a Chicano Latino writer. I'm especially thankful for the older generation of Chicano Latina writers, because you know, back when they were publishing, like when Sandra Cisneros was trying to make a career as a writer, she encountered a lot of obstacles. That generation of Chicano Latino writers had a lot of obstacles to overcome in terms of publishing. And some of them even started their own presses, you know, to try to publish their work. So I know that because of all the work that they did to create a path, I have benefited from their work. So now my goal as a Latina writer is to make the path a little bit wider for the next generation of Chicano Latino writers. And hopefully one day, you know, we can finally remove all those obstacles and just be allowed to be writers, not without the labels and without all that institutional, racism that we constantly encounter in the publishing industry and with the media and beyond.
Gary wrote, class and race have been woven through your discussion about your experience constantly. Which has played a larger role in your own identity?
Class and race. I think both, both, because obviously in Mexico, it was mostly a class issue, right? Being born in poverty, I had to deal with the stigma of being a poor person in Mexico, and just knowing that in Mexico, like, it's so difficult to move up the social and the economic ladder, and when you are poor in Mexico, most likely you're gonna be poor for the rest of your life, and your children are gonna be poor, and there's that cycle that you just can't really get out of. When I came to the US, we were still poor, but the poverty here that I experienced here was nowhere near the poverty that I lived in Mexico. So I didn't think of myself as poor when I got here. At least we had like running water, and we had, carpet on our floor, and we had a roof that didn't leak. Of course, that's when I started to then feel that the racism and what it was like, to be a Mexican immigrant, to be a Spanish speaker, that started to kind of come in more. And I didn't think so much about my poverty anymore as I thought about the challenges that I had to overcome in terms of being in a country where it's not good to be Mexican immigrant, especially an undocumented Mexican immigrant. That adds so many other barriers that when I came here, I was dealing with, cultural barriers, with language barriers, with legal barriers for being undocumented. So there were so many other barriers that I had to overcome. I also really appreciated, being able to, for example, go to community college, even though I didn't have a lot of money and my family didn't have a lot of money for my education. Community college made it possible for me to have a chance, right, at higher education by being affordable and being a little bit more within my reach. And then because I was a legal resident at the time, I also was able to benefit from, financial aid, from grants, from work study, where I could work on campus and make money for my tuition. So those are little opportunities that I had that added up to me being able to put myself through school and to be able to earn a college degree in a way that I would not have been able to earn one in my own country.
We have not a question so much as a comment from Brenda Cardenas. Thank you so much for speaking to writing as a form of activism and social justice work, and for your beautifully complex analysis and explanation of language in US Latinx communities. Brenda's in our English program here at UWM. Linda's wondering, have you ever thought of writing a children's book? And I'm going to add to that question, knowing of your adaptation of The Distance Between Us, just how one goes about doing that kind of adaptation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this is the young readers version for The Distance Between Us, and this is as close as I've gotten to writing for children. My agent keeps asking me to write a children's book, but I find it easier to write a 400-page book than a like a little, 10-page children's picture book. Um, but when I wrote The Distance Between Us, it wasn't so difficult to adapt it for young readers because the book was already mostly in the child's point of view. When I wrote the book, I I had to work really hard to figure out like what the point of view was going to be. And I decided that I really wanted to let my child self tell the story as it happened instead of letting my adult self offer commentary and reflection and have all this introspection as an adult about the events that happened to me as a kid. So I try to remove the adult as much as I could when I was writing the book, and then just fully immersing myself in my childhood memories and reliving those memories as a kid. So if you read The Distance Between Us, it is mostly a child's perspective already. So then when I adapted the book, all I had to do was to get rid of parts that were inappropriate for a young audience. So I got rid of, different sections that I just felt young readers were not quite ready for. And then I trimmed, I condensed the scenes. I got rid of like long, uh, lengthy passages, things like that. And then so then once I got rid of things, that allowed me to add a few things that are not in the original book. So I was able to add a little bit more details about my border crossing. I was able to add my prom that young readers would be interested in. So I added a few scenes in the young readers version that are not found in the other one. And I really enjoy the adaptation. I really appreciated being able to share my story with a younger audience. And of course, one of my goals when I was adapting the book was not to water it down. I just feel that sometimes books for children are too watered down. And I didn't want to do that to my book. I wanted to make sure that I honored the story the way it was written. And I also think that young readers can be very sophisticated in their reading and that they deserve, to have a story that is complex, that invites them to think about the world and other people's experiences and journeys and hardships. So that was one of my goals in the adaptation, was to not sugarcoat anything and just really honor my young readers' understanding of the story and appreciation of the story, the way I wrote it.
If I could add a detail, when we were hoping to bring Reyna in person last spring, she was also going to do a class or a school visit to Hayes Bilingual School. And I just want to do a quick shout out because thanks to Boswell Books here in Milwaukee and an anonymous donor, there were 60 copies of the young reader version of The Distance Between Us purchased for Hayes for their students. We're anxious now since they arrived after shutdown for the books to actually get in students' hands, but they're there waiting. Let's see, there was a comment from Sarah, curious what your siblings are doing now.
My siblings, well, my sister Mago just got married over the weekend in Vegas. so she's doing pretty well. Yeah, all my siblings are actually doing really well. My brother is, he works for Kaiser and he has his family, and both of his daughters are at university right now. So he's just working to put both of his, daughters through university. And then my younger sister, Betty, she recently moved to Vancouver, Washington. So she's the first one to leave California. And now she's a little bit farther from me, but we're still very close. And her son, my nephew, came to live with me. So he's been going to college here. And he just applied to transfer to a four-year university. And he's gotten accepted to 3 so far. So he's still waiting for the others that he applied to before he makes a decision. But I'm really happy to, have my nephew and to see him and help him in his journey in higher education. So yeah, right now, like our kids have come to that age where now they're the new generation of college students, and that makes me really happy because for a long time I was the only person in my family who had a university degree. um, and I'm so eager to see my nieces and nephews and my own children, go on to succeed at university. And that is something that like I found really interesting, with my husband's family. Like I said, everybody's in Wisconsin, and I was so blown away like when I first, met him, because like he told me that his mother has a master's degree, his father has a PhD, his grandmother went to the University of Madison. Um, and all his aunts and uncles have PhDs, and my husband right now is working on his doctorate, and his sister has a master's. I mean, like everybody in his family has a college degree, and I was the only one in my family who was fortunate enough to have one. But that I feel that just for me, that's something that I look forward to in the future, is for one day my grandchildren being able to say that, their aunts and uncles and cousins have degrees, and that their grandma also has a degree. So that's what I'm hopeful for in terms of the future of my side of the family.
We have a fun question from Juliet. Has the writing process ever surprised you or taught you something new about yourself? If so, in what ways?
Yeah, I think my writing is always surprising me in different ways, because it's never the same. It's never the same, and it's always hard. I always think that my next book is going to be easier, and it's not. It's just as hard. But like this book, for example, my first book, it taught me that I do have it in me to write a book. you know when I was writing this book, my biggest fear was that I wouldn't finish it, that I would just start a book and not be able to finish one. And when I finally finished this book, I knew that if I could write this book, I could write 100 books. So I got it. This book gave me a lot of confidence in myself as a writer. And then when I wrote my second book, this one, Dancing with Butterflies, this one was a really challenging book because it had 4 points of view. So I had to juggle like this multiple perspectives and a very complicated, very complex story structure. And it was a really hard book to write. It took me 4 years to figure out like all the 4 storylines and how to like combine them and all of that. But when I finished writing this book, I had a lot more confidence in my skills in terms of being able to write from multiple points of view. And then, of course, then I wrote the 2 memoirs, The Distance Between Us and A Dream Called Home. And those were very challenging books to write because my training as a writer was as a fiction writer. All of the classes I ever took in my university program were fiction classes. So when I started writing the memoirs, I had no idea how to write a memoir. I had never taken a single creative nonfiction class. I didn't know how to go about it. So I just struggled for 4 years trying to figure out how to write the memoir. And then at the end, I ended up just using a lot of my tools that I had as a novelist. I used those to write the memoir. And that's why a lot of people, when they read The Distance Between Us, they tell me it reads like a novel. And I feel like, well, I guess because I ended up using everything I had learned as a novelist to write the book. So I figured out eventually. And when I wrote that memoir, one of the things that I learned was that in my fiction, even though I was writing a lot about my own experiences, I was not healing from my trauma because I was hiding behind the fiction. Every time I wrote, even though I was using my own pain and my own, experiences to write the book, ultimately it was still fiction. I was creating characters. So there was like a distance between me and the story I was writing. But when I wrote The Distance Between Us, now I was the protagonist of the story. There was no more hiding behind the fiction. I had to confront it. I had to confront my reality. I had to confront my trauma and my past. And I was the protagonist of this story. So it was a very like emotionally painful journey to write this book. But when I finished writing it, I realized that this book has set me free in a way that my novels had not. This book set me free. It allowed me to finally understand why things had happened the way they had, and to celebrate, my experiences and my past. And then best of all, that book helped me to understand my parents a lot more and to have more compassion for them. Because whenever I looked at my parents, I always looked at them through the eyes of their daughter, and there was a lot of anger, there was a lot of resentment going on. But when they became characters in my memoir, I had to see them through the eyes of a writer. And by seeing them as a writer, I was able to have more compassion and more understanding for them than I have ever had in my life. So that was a lesson that the memoirs taught me in terms of how to see my family in a different way, and just to understand that my parents are just human beings, with all their flaws and all their virtues.
Maybe we can fit in one more question if that's okay. I'll go with somebody we haven't had a question from before. Anna wrote, have you ever struggled to stay true to your writing voice when you read other people's work, or struggled to find your identity? And if so, what is your strategy for staying true to your unique style and voice?
Yeah, I don't think I have had a hard time in terms of like staying true to my voice. I wish I could replicate how Sandra Cisneros writes, that wouldn't be a bad thing. So I try to read like a lot of books, and there's so many books that I love. And so many times I find myself wishing I could write like that, like, oh, I wish I had written that book, or I wish I could have that voice, and that my prose could be that beautiful. But I just write how I write, and I don't try to force myself to sound like something that I am not. But one interesting thing though that I've noticed is that when I write fiction, my writing is a lot more poetic. So if you read my novels, even like the novel that I'm just finishing up right now, there's a lot of poetry in it. And I don't write poetry because I find it really hard to write poetry. But somehow when I write fiction, there's like this the poet in me comes out. And there's, this like beautiful images and beautiful passages and things like that. Whereas I notice that when I write nonfiction, when I write my memoirs or personal essays, the writing tends to be a little bit more straightforward and not as, pretty language and pretty images. And I don't know why that is. I think part of it is just the emotion, like it takes so much like emotional energy to write about these things about my life, and then making myself like really vulnerable, that I would rather focus on being very honest with the emotion instead of like trying to bring in the pretty language. I don't know, like there's just something very different that happens when I decide to write memoir. There's a switch in the voice.
I think we'll end with, there are many, many lovely comments to you in the chat. I'm going to end with the comment from Shane. Reyna, thank you for your sharing your personal and literary struggles. Your candor and intimacy about living and writing are truly inspiring. By sharing your journey to understand yourself, you give us the courage to understand ourselves and others. Reyna, thank you so very much. I appreciate your time, everyone's time today. If you would like to turn off your mic, on your camera, either or both, or applaud silently, please do. I'd like Reyna to know of our appreciation. Thank you so much.
Thank you. That was wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you
Can't
so
wait
much
to read
for
your novels.
Thank you, Wanda.
Thank
Thanks,
you,
everybody.
bye.
Gracias.
Thank you. Thanks for joining us. Hello, Paula Mason, before you go. Franklin, your mic is off.
Yeah, hi Julie. Sorry, I didn't do my video because I have a rambunctious toddler over here and it's been busy. But I've had it running in the background and it's been so wonderful to listen to Reyna and catch everything.
That is good.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks.
Yep, we'll touch base. Thanks. Have a good night.
Thank you all. Thanks very much. Thanks again, Lynn, for being back up. And Shane, thank you for that nice closing statement. Have a good night, everybody.